When the bombs were falling on Berlin and the Soviet army was advancing relentlessly toward the heart of Germany, Adolf Hitler remained locked in an underground bunker 17 meters below ground. It was April of 1945. The Third Reich was in its death throes. But while the entire world celebrated the imminent end of the Nazi nightmare, something extraordinary was happening in the shadows. Classified documents, testimonies hidden for decades, and undercover operations reveal a truth that the Allied powers tried to silence for years. Hitler did not simply plan to surrender or die in his bunker. There was a plan. A secret plan, meticulously designed, involving ghost submarines, escape routes to South America, an impregnable fortress in the Alps, and a network of collaborators willing to risk everything to get the dictator out of Europe. Why did American, British, and Soviet intelligence services keep open files on Hitler's possible survival for decades after the end of the war? What did FBI agents discover in Argentina that forced them to investigate for more than 10 years? How is it possible that German submarines reached South American shores weeks after the official surrender? And the most disturbing question of all, did Adolf Hitler really die on the 30th of April, 1945? Or was that simply the version the world needed to believe? Before you settle in, take a moment to give the video a big like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who joins us from all over the world. What you are about to discover will completely change your perception of the last days of the Nazi regime. During the next few minutes, we are going to unravel one of the greatest and most disturbing mysteries of the 20th century. We will examine declassified documents, eyewitness testimonies, and intelligence reports that have remained sealed for generations, as well as evidence suggesting that the official history may be incomplete. Let us start at the beginning. To understand Hitler's secret plan, we must first understand the dictator's mind and the circumstances that led him to consider the possibility of defeat. Adolf Hitler was born on the 20th of April, 1889, in Braunau am Inn, a small border town between Austria and Germany. From his youth, he demonstrated a stubborn personality, incapable of accepting failure. When he was rejected twice by the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, he did not blame his lack of talent or his insufficient preparation. Instead, he directed his resentment toward those he considered responsible for his misfortunes: the elites, the intellectuals, and above all, the Jews. This inability to accept defeat became a defining trait of his character. During the First World War, when Germany surrendered in November of 1918, Hitler was in a military hospital recovering from a mustard gas attack that had left him temporarily blind. The news of the German capitulation devastated him. According to his own words in Mein Kampf, it was at that moment that he decided to dedicate his life to politics. But even more importantly, it was at that moment that he began to develop what historians call the stab-in-the-back legend, the theory that Germany had not lost the war on the battlefield but had been betrayed from within by internal enemies. This paranoid and conspiratorial mentality would define the entire Nazi project. And when, 26 years later, Hitler again faced the prospect of a catastrophic defeat, his mind functioned in exactly the same way. He could not accept that he had lost. He could not admit that his vision of the 1,000-year Reich had collapsed in just 12. There had to be another explanation. There had to be a way out. When did Hitler begin to seriously contemplate the possibility of defeat? Historians place this crucial moment in the summer of 1944, specifically after the failed assassination attempt on the 20th of July. On that day, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg placed a bomb in the conference room of Hitler's headquarters at the Wolf's Lair, located in the dense forests of East Prussia. The explosion killed 4 people, but Hitler miraculously survived, protected by the solid oak table he had leaned over to examine a map. The attack changed Hitler in profound and disturbing ways. He had always been suspicious, but after the 20th of July, his paranoia reached pathological levels. He began to suspect practically all of his generals. He ordered massive purges that resulted in the execution of nearly 5,000 people, directly or indirectly linked to the conspiracy. And, significantly, he began to plan for a future in which a military defeat could become a reality. This is where the story becomes truly fascinating. Because while Hitler publicly proclaimed his unwavering faith in final victory, in private he was authorizing a series of covert operations aimed at ensuring his survival and the continuity of the Nazi project beyond the war. The first and most ambitious of these plans was the so-called Alpenfestung, or Alpine Fortress. The idea was simple, but grandiose: to turn the Bavarian and Austrian Alps into an impregnable redoubt where Nazi forces could resist indefinitely, even after the fall of Berlin. Nazi planners imagined a network of underground tunnels, hidden factories in the mountains, weapons depots, and enough supplies to sustain tens of thousands of combatants for years. The concept of the Alpenfestung was not a delusional fantasy. There were historical precedents for prolonged resistance in mountainous terrain. Spanish guerrillas had resisted for years against Napoleonic forces in the mountain ranges of the Iberian Peninsula. The Swiss had built a system of alpine fortifications that deterred any possible invasion, and the Nazis themselves had experienced the difficulties of fighting in mountainous terrain during the Balkans campaign. Starting in the fall of 1944, reports began to reach Allied intelligence services about suspicious activities in the Alpine region. There was talk of truck convoys transporting industrial equipment into the mountains. Massive excavations in remote locations were mentioned. Reports came in about the construction of secret landing strips and the stockpiling of provisions in enormous quantities. How much of this was real and how much was Nazi propaganda designed to frighten the Allies? This question has generated intense debates among historians for decades. What we know for certain is that the Allies took the threat very seriously. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, modified his strategic plans specifically to prevent Hitler from being able to retreat to the Alps and prolong the war. In February of 1945, American intelligence services issued a classified report describing the Alpenfestung as the most important problem facing Allied forces in the final stages of the European War. The report estimated that the Alpine fortress could house up to 200,000 elite combatants, including the most fanatical units of the SS, equipped with modern weaponry and supplies to resist for 2 years or more. But the Alpenfestung was not just a defensive refuge. It was also the starting point for something much more ambitious. Because from the Alpine mountains, the escape routes to the south were open. Through Italy, Mediterranean ports could be reached. From Spain, neutral throughout the war under the regime of Francisco Franco, it was possible to embark for South America. And in South America, a network of Nazi sympathizers waited, prepared to receive the fugitives. This network, known colloquially as Odessa, although historians debate whether a centralized organization with that name actually existed or if it was multiple decentralized networks, began to form long before the end of the war. As early as 1943, when the tide of the war began to change clearly in favor of the Allies after the German defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk, some Nazi leaders began to transfer assets abroad and establish contacts in neutral countries. Argentina became the preferred destination for several reasons. The country was governed by Juan Domingo Perón, whose regime maintained an ambiguous position toward Nazism. The German-Argentine community was numerous and influential. The vast stretches of Patagonia offered remote places where it was possible to disappear without a trace. And perhaps most importantly, the Argentine government had a long tradition of granting political asylum without asking too many questions. Declassified FBI documents reveal that the American agency began to investigate the possible presence of fugitive Nazis in Argentina as early as 1945, immediately after the end of the war. But what is truly surprising is that these investigations continued for more than a decade, and that at various times FBI agents seriously believed that Hitler could be alive and hidden in South America. Why was the FBI still looking for Hitler years after his supposed death? The answer has to do with the strange and unsatisfactory circumstances that surrounded the dictator's end. According to the official version, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker on the 30th of April, 1945, by shooting himself in the right temple while simultaneously biting a cyanide capsule. His body and that of Eva Braun, whom he had married just the day before, were taken to the garden of the Reich Chancellery, doused with gasoline and burned. The charred remains were subsequently buried by SSS officers in a nearby bomb crater. This is the story we learned in textbooks, but there are significant problems with this narrative, problems that fueled theories about Hitler's survival for decades. The first and most obvious is that there is no direct and indisputable physical evidence of Hitler's death. The bodies were burned, supposedly until they were unrecognizable. The remains were buried in a hurry while the Soviet army fought its way toward the bunker. And when the Soviets finally took control of the area, they took what was left without allowing any independent inspection. For nearly 50 years, the only ones who claimed to possess Hitler's remains were the Soviets, and their evidence was always controversial. In 1946, they presented fragments of a skull and jawbone that supposedly belonged to the dictator, but they never allowed Western experts to examine these remains independently. And when finally, decades later, DNA analyses were performed, the results were disconcerting. In 2009, a team of American researchers was given access to the skull fragment that the Soviets claimed was Hitler's. DNA analysis revealed that the skull belonged to a woman, not a man. This discovery, published in a respected scientific journal, caused a small media commotion, although it was quickly downplayed by other historians who pointed out that there were still other fragments that had not been analysed. The second problem with the official version has to do with the testimonies of the survivors. The main witnesses to Hitler's final moments were members of his innermost circle: his personal pilot Hans Bauer, his valet Heinz Linger, his secretary Traudl Junger, and some SS officers. All of them were captured by the Soviets after the fall of Berlin and subjected to extensive interrogations. Their testimonies coincided on the basic details of the suicide story. However, one must remember that these witnesses were in an extraordinarily delicate situation. They were prisoners of war in Soviet hands, a fate that for many Nazis was equivalent to a death sentence, or in the best case, years of forced labor in Siberia. What incentive did they have to tell the truth if this truth contradicted what the Soviets wanted to hear? And what would happen if they had received specific instructions from Hitler about what version of events they should tell in case they were captured? This last question is not as far-fetched as it might seem. Hitler was famous for his obsessive attention to detail and for his ability to anticipate future scenarios. If he had actually planned an escape, it would have been logical for him to also plan a credible alibi to cover his flight. And a staged suicide with carefully selected witnesses who could confirm the details under interrogation would have been exactly the type of deception the master of propaganda would have devised. Is there evidence to suggest that Hitler indeed planned his escape? Declassified documents reveal some disturbing coincidences. First, there is the issue of the submarines. In the final weeks of the war, the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, sent an unusually high number of submarines towards South America. Two of these submarines, the U-530 and the U-977, surrendered in Argentine ports in July and August of 1945, respectively, weeks after the official German capitulation. Their commanders claimed to have sailed to Argentina simply to avoid falling into the hands of the Allies in Europe. But the interrogations revealed inconsistencies in their accounts. The U-530 arrived in Mar del Plata, Argentina, on the 10th of July 1945, more than 2 months after the German surrender. Its commander, Lieutenant Otto Vermuth, was only 25 years old and had little experience in long-range ocean navigation. Nevertheless, he had managed to cross the Atlantic without being detected at a time when the Allies controlled practically all maritime routes. Even more suspicious, when Argentine authorities inspected the submarine, they discovered that its logbook had been partially destroyed and that several official documents were missing. The U-977 arrived in Argentina on the 17th of August, 1945, after a voyage of more than 100 days. Its commander, Heinz Schaffer, later wrote a book about the trip in which he categorically denied any connection with Hitler or Nazi evacuation operations. However, researchers have pointed out numerous inconsistencies in his story. The time it took the submarine to reach Argentina does not match the normal cruising speed of that type of vessel. This suggests it made intermediate stops somewhere, stops that were never satisfactorily explained. But perhaps the most intriguing thing of all is what we do not know. How many other German submarines sailed towards unknown destinations in the final days of the war? How many were never located or surrendered? German naval records from that period are incomplete, partially destroyed in the final days of the conflict. Some historians estimate that at least 10 long-range submarines disappeared without a trace after April of 1945. Where did they go? What were they carrying? And who was on board? The theories about Hitler's escape route are varied, but the most elaborate, and the one with the most circumstantial evidence, is the one that places him fleeing first to Spain and then to Argentina. Spain, under the government of Francisco Franco, was the most reliable ally the Nazis had outside the borders of the Reich. Franco owed his victory in the Spanish Civil War largely to the military support of Hitler and Mussolini. Although Spain remained officially neutral during the Second World War, this neutrality was always favourable to the Axis. Thousands of Spanish volunteers fought alongside the Germans on the Eastern Front as part of the Blue Division. Spanish companies traded with Germany despite the Allied blockade, and Spanish intelligence services collaborated closely with their Nazi counterparts. Declassified documents reveal that multiple escape routes existed through Spain. The best known is the so-called Rat Line, Rattenlinien in German, which began in Germany or Austria, crossed Italy to Mediterranean ports, and from there led to Barcelona or other Spanish ports. From Spain, fugitives could embark for Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, or Chile. But there was another route, less known but potentially more relevant to the case of Hitler. This route did not pass through Italy or the Alps, but went directly toward northern Spain through France. The Pyrenees, the mountain range that separates France from Spain, were full of secret passes used for centuries by smugglers and refugees. During the Second World War, these same routes were used to evacuate Allied pilots shot down over occupied territory. Why could they not have been used in the opposite direction to evacuate Nazis? There is a particularly intriguing testimony that it connects Hitler with this Pyrenean route. In 1987, an elderly Spaniard named Angel Alcazar de Velasco published a memoir in which he claimed to have been a spy for the Nazis during the war. According to his account, in the final weeks of April of 1945, he received instructions to prepare an escape route through the Pyrenees for a person of utmost importance. Alcazar de Velasco never explicitly identified this person as Hitler, but the dates and circumstances coincide in a disturbing way. Of course, the memoirs of an old man written 40 years after the facts do not constitute reliable historical evidence. Alcazar de Velasco might well have invented or exaggerated his story to sell books, but his testimony is part of a broader pattern of clues, suggesting that something extraordinary was happening on the Franco-Spanish border in the final weeks of the war. And what happened after Spain? This is where the story becomes even more fascinating, because the evidence of Nazi presence in Argentina after the war is overwhelming. We know for certain that thousands of Nazi war criminals escaped to Argentina in the years following 1945. Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the final solution, lived in Buenos Aires under a false identity for more than a decade before being captured by the Israeli Mossad in 1960. Josef Mengele, the infamous Angel of Death of Auschwitz, also found refuge in Argentina before moving to Paraguay and Brazil, where he died in 1979 without ever having been brought to justice. Erich Priebke, responsible for the Ardeatine Caves massacre in Italy, lived quietly in the Argentine city of San Carlos de Bariloche for nearly 50 years before being extradited to Italy in the 90s. If these notorious criminals could escape and live for decades without being discovered, why could Hitler himself not have done the same? Declassified FBI files contain dozens of reports on alleged sightings of Hitler in South America. The most detailed of these reports is dated the 21st of September, 1945, just 5 months after the dictator's supposed death. An informant identified only as a reliable confidential source reported to the FB1 that Hitler had arrived in Argentina by submarine approximately 2.5 weeks earlier. According to this report, Hitler was living in the foothills of the Andes, in a remote area near the border with Chile. The FBI took this report seriously enough to open a formal investigation. Agents interviewed witnesses, requested information from Argentine authorities, who, predictably, denied any knowledge, and compiled a file that eventually reached hundreds of pages. The investigation failed to confirm Hitler's presence in Argentina, but it could not definitively rule it out either. The case remained officially open for years. But this was not the only report. Throughout the following decades, dozens of similar testimonies reached the FBI from Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Colombia, and other Latin American countries. Some were clearly fantasies or attempts at fraud. Others were harder to dismiss. A particularly detailed report from 1954 described a ranch in Argentine Patagonia where an elderly German man supposedly lived who matched Hitler's physical description. The ranch was protected by armed guards and surrounded by barbed wire. Locals knew not to ask questions about its mysterious occupant. Was this old man really Adolf Hitler? Probably not. But the fact that these stories circulated for decades and that intelligence agencies took them seriously enough to investigate them reveals how much uncertainty existed about the dictator's final fate. This uncertainty was deliberately fueled by the Soviets themselves. Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator, had reasons to keep alive the myth that Hitler could have escaped. In the first place, it allowed him to pressure the Western Allies, suggesting they had been negligent in allowing the world's most wanted war criminal to escape. In the second place, it justified continued Soviet surveillance of the movements of former Nazis, something that was part of the broader strategy of the Cold War. At the Potsdam Conference, held in July and August of 1945, Stalin surprised Allied leaders by openly suggesting that Hitler could be alive. When American President Harry Truman asked if Hitler was dead, Stalin responded evasively that he was not sure. This response caused consternation among the Western Allies, who had considered the case closed based on the testimonies of the bunker survivors. Did Stalin know something the Westerners did not? Or was he simply playing political games? Historians have debated this question for decades without reaching a consensus. What is indubitable is that Soviet ambiguity contributed to fueling theories about Hitler's survival during the post-war period. But let us return to the escape plan itself. Because beyond speculation about whether Hitler actually survived, there is documentary evidence that detailed plans were designed for his evacuation. The mastermind behind these plans was, according to multiple sources, Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal secretary and one of the most powerful officials of the Third Reich. Bormann was known for his ruthless bureaucratic efficiency and for his ability to operate in the shadows. While other Nazi figures sought public glory, Bormann was content to accumulate real power behind the scenes. Starting in 1943, Bormann began to implement what historians call Action Adlerflug, or Operation Eagle Flight. This was a secret program to transfer Nazi assets abroad: gold, currency, works of art, documents, and eventually, people. The funds were channeled through Swiss banks, shell corporations in neutral countries, and networks of collaborators in South America. The exact details of this operation remain partially obscure, but we know it involved enormous amounts of wealth. A 1946 US Treasury report estimated that at least $500 million in Nazi assets had been transferred to neutral countries during the final years of the war. Adjusted to current values, this would be equivalent to more than $7 billion. Why was such an amount of money needed if not to finance the lives of high-profile fugitives for decades? Bormann also supervised the creation of false identification documents for the Nazi hierarchs who would need to escape. Contacts were established with corrupt officials in neutral countries who could provide passports and visas. Safe routes through Europe and embarkation points in lightly monitored Mediterranean and Atlantic ports were identified. Was Hitler one of the beneficiaries of this elaborate escape system? Conventional historians say no. They argue that Hitler was too physically and mentally deteriorated to undertake a flight, that his sense of duty forced him to remain in Berlin until the end, and that the testimonies of the bunker survivors are consistent and credible. But other researchers point out that precisely because Bormann controlled access to Hitler in the final months, he was in the perfect position to orchestrate a substitution or a deception. The most elaborate theory suggests that Hitler was evacuated from the Berlin bunker several days before his supposed death. A double, carefully prepared, would have remained in the bunker to stage the suicide and provide credible testimony to the Soviets. Meanwhile, the real Hitler would have been transported out of the city, possibly by air, toward a meeting point where his journey toward freedom would begin. Does it sound like science fiction? Perhaps. But the idea of using doubles was not at all alien to Hitler. It is known for certain that the Nazi regime employed multiple doubles of the dictator for public appearances considered too dangerous. Some of these doubles were trained for years to imitate Hitler's gestures, voice, and mannerisms. Why could one of them not have been used for the final act? There is a disturbing detail that supports this theory. Among the remains found by the Soviets in the Chancellery Garden were two partially charred bodies that were supposedly Hitler and Eva Braun. But there were also other bodies, including that of a male of a physical build similar to Hitler's, who was never satisfactorily identified. Was this the real Hitler? Or was it the double who had been sacrificed to complete the deception? The answer to this question was literally buried when the Soviets took the remains to Moscow. For decades, these remains were guarded in secret by Soviet intelligence services. In 1970, by order of Yuri Andropov, then head of the KGB, the remains were exhumed, completely incinerated, and the ashes thrown into a river. The official justification was to prevent the grave from becoming a place of pilgrimage for neo-Nazis. But many have wondered if the real reason was not to destroy evidence that contradicted the official version. At this point, it is necessary to pause and reflect on what we are discussing. We are not categorically stating that Hitler escaped from the Berlin bunker and lived his final years in Argentina. What we are pointing out is that a significant amount of circumstantial evidence exists that contradicts or at least complicates the official version of his death. And what is equally important, we are documenting that concrete and elaborate plans existed for his evacuation, plans that involved the resources and logistical capabilities of the Nazi apparatus in its final moments. Why does this matter 80 years later? Because history is not just a collection of facts from the past. History shapes our understanding of the present and our expectations for the future. If Hitler died in his bunker like a coward who preferred to commit suicide rather than face justice, that sends a particular message about the fate of tyrants. But if Hitler managed to escape and live with impunity for years or decades more, that tells a very different story about the capacity of the powerful to evade the consequences of their crimes. Let us continue with our investigation, because there are aspects of this mystery that we have not yet explored. One of the most fascinating elements of the Nazi survival plan was the so-called Base 211, supposedly located in Antarctica. This is perhaps the most controversial and, for many, the most implausible part of the whole story. But it deserves to be examined because it forms part of the broader historical context. In 1938, Germany sent an expedition to Antarctica. Officially, the purpose was to explore the region and claim territory for the Reich. The expedition, aboard the ship Schwabenland, mapped an extensive area of the frozen continent and named it Neuschwabenland, New Swabia. The expedition's planes dropped thousands of swastika flags onto the ice to mark the German territorial claim. Up to this point, the historical facts are indisputable. What comes next is much more speculative. According to the most extreme theories, the Nazis not only explored Antarctica, but established a secret base there where they developed advanced weapons, and where eventually some hierarchs found refuge after the war. These theories often incorporate elements of science fiction, such as Nazi flying saucers and anti-gravity technology. Most serious historians dismiss them as groundless fantasies. What do you think of the content? Do you like this type of video? Then comment with the phrase, "I want more stories." That way you will encourage us to bring more historical topics, and you will also help the engagement of the video, okay? Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and leave your like so that YouTube continues recommending our videos to you. However, there are aspects of Nazi Antarctic history that deserve attention. It is true that Germany invested significant resources in Antarctic exploration at a time when it was actively preparing for war. Why? The claimed territory was thousands of kilometers from any relevant strategic objective. The natural resources of Antarctica were inaccessible with the technology of the time. What did the Nazis expect to obtain from this expedition? A pragmatic explanation is that they sought to establish bases for their submarines in the South Atlantic. During the Second World War, German submarines operated extensively in South American waters, attacking Allied trade. An Antarctic base could have provided a refueling point for these operations, but no evidence was ever found that such a base was actually built. Another explanation has to do with post-war geopolitics. If the Nazis anticipated a possible defeat and planned for the survival of the movement, having claimed territory on a remote and inaccessible continent could be valuable. Antarctica was, in a sense, beyond the reach of the Allied powers. A refuge there would be extremely difficult to locate and attack. Is this the reason why the United States sent a massive military expedition to Antarctica in 1946 and 47? Operation High Jump, as it was called, was the largest Antarctic expedition in history up to that point. It involved 13 ships, including an aircraft carrier, more than 4,000 soldiers and support personnel, and numerous planes and helicopters. Officially, the purpose was to train military personnel in polar conditions and perform scientific research, but the scale of the operation seemed disproportionate for these declared objectives. Conspiracy theories claim that the true purpose of Operation High Jump was to locate and destroy Nazi Base 211. Supposedly, the expedition encountered armed resistance and suffered significant losses before withdrawing prematurely. There is no credible evidence to support these claims, but the operation did end sooner than planned, and the official reasons for this early termination were never fully explained. Let us leave Antarctic speculation for now and return to more solid ground, because there is another aspect of the Nazi survival plan that is much better documented: the escape network known as the rat lines, Rattenlinien. This system of escape routes was not improvised in the final days of the war. It began to be established systematically at least from 1943, when the prospect of defeat began to seem real to the regime's most clear-sighted planners. The routes used a combination of false documents, bribes, contacts in neutral countries, and, surprisingly, the collaboration of certain religious institutions. The role of the Vatican and the Catholic Church in the evacuation of Nazi war criminals remains one of the most controversial aspects of this story. Documents show that certain Vatican officials, including Bishop Alois Hudal, provided active assistance to fugitive Nazis. Hudal obtained International Red Cross travel documents for the war criminals, secured them lodging in Catholic institutions during their transit through Italy, and connected them with sympathizers in South America. The motivations of Hudal and other ecclesiastics who participated in these activities have been the subject of intense debate. Some argue that they acted out of ideological conviction, genuinely sympathizing with anti-Semitism and Nazi anti-communism. Others suggest they were manipulated or acted for ill-conceived humanitarian reasons, believing they were helping persecuted refugees rather than perpetrators of atrocities. And still others point to the financial connections between the Vatican and Nazi funds transferred through European banks. Whatever the motivation, the result was the same. Thousands of Nazi war criminals were able to escape thanks in part to the assistance provided by Catholic Church officials. If lower-ranking people could benefit from this system, why could Hitler himself not have done it? A common objection to the theory of Hitler's survival is that it would have been impossible to keep such a secret for so many years. If Hitler lived in Argentina or anywhere else for decades after the war, how is it possible that no one recognized him? How is it possible that none of the thousands of people who would necessarily have been involved in his protection revealed the truth? This objection carries weight, but it is not conclusive. Let us consider the case of Adolf Eichmann, mentioned earlier. Eichmann lived in Argentina for more than a decade under the false name of Ricardo Clement. He worked in a Mercedes-Benz factory. His children attended local schools. He lived a relatively normal life in the suburbs of Buenos Aires. And yet, his true identity remained hidden until the Israeli Mossad located him through a systematic intelligence operation. Eichmann was not a minor character. He was widely known as the architect of the deportation and extermination of European Jews. His face had appeared in photographs and films of the Nazi era. And yet, he was able to live for years without being detected in a country where an active Jewish community and organizations that actively sought war criminals existed. If Eichmann could remain hidden, why not Hitler? It is true that Hitler was much more recognizable than Eichmann. His face was probably the most photographed in the world at that time. But let us consider the factors that could have facilitated his concealment. First, Hitler's appearance in 1945 was radically different from the public image everyone knew. The final months of the war had devastated his health. He trembled constantly due to what was probably Parkinson's disease. He walked stooped. His face was swollen, possibly due to the medications administered by his personal physician, the controversial Dr. Theodor Morell. If he shaved off his characteristic mustache and adopted other clothing, he could have been unrecognizable even to people who had known him. Second, post-war Argentina was a place where Germans could easily disappear. The German-Argentine community was enormous, concentrated in certain regions like Patagonia and the surroundings of Cordoba. One more German among thousands did not attract attention, and the culture of not asking questions about the past of newcomers was deeply rooted. Third, the Perón regime provided active protection to fugitive Nazis. It was not simply that the government looked the other way. There were deliberate policies to facilitate the immigration of Europeans considered desirable, including many with Nazi pasts. Immigration officials were instructed not to investigate too deeply the backgrounds of certain immigrants, and the Argentine secret police maintained surveillance over the activities of foreign intelligence services, hindering search operations. Finally, there is the question of money. The funds transferred by Bormann and others before the end of the war were sufficient to buy long-term protection. Private security guards, remote properties, corrupt officials, perfect false documents. All of this could be acquired with enough resources. And if the reports on the magnitude of the evacuated Nazi assets are even approximately correct, there were more than enough resources. But what happened to Hitler's personal life? If he really escaped and lived for years or decades more, what would that existence have been like? Some researchers have speculated about this based on the dictator's psychological profile and the patterns observed in other war criminals who managed to escape. Hitler was, according to all accounts, an extraordinarily egocentric and narcissistic person. His sense of personal importance was immeasurable. He genuinely believed he was the savior designated by destiny to lead the Aryan race to glory. This profile suggests that Hitler would have found it extremely difficult to live in anonymity. He was not the type of person who could be content with a quiet existence in a lost town in Patagonia. He needed admiration, deference, the feeling that he controlled the events around him. An exile in obscurity would have been, in a certain sense, a punishment worse than death for someone with his psychology. On the other hand, Hitler demonstrated throughout his life a remarkable ability to adapt to circumstances when necessary. During his years as a vagrant in Vienna, he survived in conditions of extreme poverty. During his imprisonment in Landsberg after the failed putsch of 1923, he adapted to prison life and used it productively to write Mein Kampf. If his survival depended on remaining hidden, perhaps he would have found ways to satisfy his psychological needs within those limitations. One theory suggests that Hitler would have maintained a small circle of devoted followers even in exile. These followers would have provided him with the admiration and deference he needed, creating a kind of miniature court where the Führer could continue to feel important. The reports of remote properties in Patagonia surrounded by armed guards and barbed wire are consistent with this scenario. Another theory, even more speculative, suggests that Hitler might have tried to influence political events from his exile. The emergence of neo-fascism in several countries during the post-war period, the establishment of international extreme-right networks, the protection provided to war criminals by certain governments. Could these phenomena have been coordinated or encouraged from some hidden command center? There is no direct evidence to support this idea, but it forms part of the imaginary surrounding survival theories. When would Hitler have died if he actually survived the war? The date most commonly mentioned in speculative theories is sometime in the 1960s or early 70s. Hitler would then have been between 70 and 80 years old, an advanced but not exceptional age for the time. His health, already deteriorated in 1945, would probably have worsened progressively. Parkinson's, if that was indeed his diagnosis, is a progressive disease that eventually completely incapacitates the patient. Curiously, some of the most detailed reports of Hitler sightings in South America cease around the mid-60s. Is it because he died at that time, or simply because public interest in the subject began to decline and there were fewer people willing to report sightings? There is one last element of this story that we must examine: the role of Allied intelligence services, particularly American ones. Declassified documents reveal that American intelligence agencies maintained an active interest in Hitler's possible survival for much longer than they publicly admitted. The FBI, as we already mentioned, investigated multiple reports of the sightings for years, but the CIA and its predecessor organizations were also involved. What is particularly disturbing is that these agencies were not only investigating, they were also actively recruiting former Nazis for their own operations. Operation Paperclip, for example, brought hundreds of German scientists to the United States, including many with compromised Nazi pasts. Werner von Braun, the father of the American space program, had been a member of the Nazi Party and an SS officer. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, responsible for torture and murder during the German occupation of France, was employed as a US intelligence agent before escaping to Bolivia with the help of the CIA. If the American government was willing to employ Nazi war criminals when it suited its Cold War interests, would it also have been willing to look the other way regarding Hitler if there were strategic reasons to do so? This is an uncomfortable but necessary question. One theory, impossible to verify but circulating in certain circles, suggests that Hitler was indeed captured or located by American intelligence services, but that the decision was made at the highest level not to reveal it publicly. The hypothetical reasons for such a decision vary, avoiding the political turbulence that a trial of Hitler would cause, keeping the issue as leverage against the Soviets, or simply because the aging and sick figure that remained of Hitler no longer represented a real threat. This theory lacks direct documentary evidence, but it is consistent with other behavioral patterns observed in post-war American policy, where Cold War imperatives often prevailed over considerations of justice or morality. We come now to the most fundamental question. What do we really know beyond all speculation? We know for certain the following. First, that detailed plans existed for the evacuation of Nazi leaders before the end of the war. Bormann's Operation Eagle Flight is documented. The escape routes through Italy and Spain are documented. The transfers of assets to neutral countries are documented. Second, that thousands of Nazi war criminals indeed escaped using these routes and these resources. Eichmann, Mengele, Priebke, and many others are verified cases. The system worked. Third, that the Soviets, who were the only ones to take control of the area where Hitler supposedly died, never provided conclusive evidence of his death. The remains they presented were questioned, and most of them were subsequently destroyed. Fourth, that Western intelligence agencies kept open the possibility of Hitler's survival for years, actively investigating reports suggesting he was alive. Fifth, that Perón's Argentine government provided systematic refuge to fugitive Nazis, and that the protection structures in that country were sophisticated and effective. What we do not know for certain is if Hitler personally benefited from these escape systems. The evidence is circumstantial, not direct. The testimonies of the bunker survivors, although not infallible, are consistent in stating that Hitler died on the 30th of April, 1945. And the logic of human behavior suggests that a secret of this magnitude would have been extraordinarily difficult to maintain for decades. But the absence of certainty is not the same as confirmation of the official version. History is full of cases where the official truth turned out to be incorrect or incomplete. And the specific circumstances that surrounded Hitler's death, the destruction of evidence, Soviet secrecy, and conflicting political interests make this case particularly resistant to definitive conclusions. Does it really matter what happened? Hitler, if he survived, is certainly dead now. His crimes are documented independently of his personal fate. The Holocaust happened. Millions died. The historical responsibility of Nazism does not depend on where or when its leader died. And yet, it matters. It matters because history depends on the truth. It matters because the victims of Nazism deserve to know if the primary architect of their suffering faced some form of justice. It matters because the myths about Hitler's survival have been used by neo-Nazi movements to maintain an obscene hope that their ideology could resurface. And perhaps more than anything, it matters because it reminds us of the limits of our knowledge. We think we know how the Second World War ended. We think we know how Hitler died, but the evidence, examined critically, reveals that there is much that we simply do not know, and that epistemological humility is essential for any honest understanding of the past. What do you think? After examining all this evidence, do you believe that Hitler died in his bunker as the official history says? Or do you believe there is a reasonable possibility that he escaped and lived additional years in anonymity? Tell us in the comments. But before you answer, there are more aspects of this story that we must explore. Because the Nazi survival plan was not just about Hitler as an individual, it was about the survival of the Nazi movement as such, of its ideas, its resources, and its capabilities. And what we will discover next is perhaps even more disturbing than any theory about the dictator's personal fate. The concept of the Fourth Reich was not born with post-war neo-Nazis. It was anticipated and planned by the leaders of the Third Reich themselves in their final days. Documents captured at the end of the war reveal discussions among Nazi hierarchs about how to preserve the movement for an eventual resurrection. The central idea was simple but powerful. If Germany lost the war, Nazism could survive in exile, accumulating resources, maintaining contact networks, and waiting for the right moment to return. Planners anticipated that tensions between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union would eventually lead to a new war. In that scenario, a reorganized Nazi movement could emerge as a relevant actor, perhaps even as an ally of the West against communism. This strategy was not as delusional as it might seem. The Cold War effectively began almost immediately after the end of the Second World War. and American policy toward former Nazis effectively evolved in the direction planners had anticipated, from relentless persecution to a much more pragmatic attitude that prioritized anti-communist utility over historical justice. What would have happened if this strategy had been more completely successful? It is a counterfactual question, but it is worth considering. If the fugitive Nazis had managed to organize themselves more effectively in exile, if they had kept their resources intact, if they had waited patiently for the right moment, would they have been able to significantly influence post-war world politics? To a certain extent, they did. Nazi scientists recruited by Operation Paperclip contributed decisively to the American space program and the development of ballistic missiles. Nazi intelligence experts were employed by the CIA and other Western agencies for operations against the Soviet Union. German industrialists who had financed the Nazi regime continued their business activities almost without interruption, some becoming prominent figures in the post-war economy. But these were individuals integrated into Western structures, not an organized movement pursuing its own goals. The Fourth Reich, as such, never materialized. The networks of Nazi exiles in South America remained fragmented and marginal. The neo-Nazi movements that emerged in subsequent decades never managed to achieve significant political relevance in any major country. Why did this survival strategy fail? Several factors contributed. In the first place, the magnitude of Nazi crimes was gradually revealed in its full extent. The Nuremberg trials publicly exposed the atrocities of the regime. Survivors of the extermination camps told their stories. Documentary proof of the final solution was presented to the world. This made it extremely difficult for any openly Nazi movement to gain legitimacy or significant support. In the second place, Hitler's own death or disappearance deprived the movement of its central figure. Nazism was, to a large extent, a cult of personality centered on the Führer. Without Hitler, the movement lacked a charismatic leader capable of unifying the different factions and providing strategic direction. In the third place, the conditions that had allowed the rise of Nazism in Germany were not replicated in other countries. The specific combination of national humiliation after the First World War, devastating economic crisis, institutional weakness of the Weimar Republic, and particular cultural traditions that existed in Germany was not found elsewhere. Post-war fascist movements in other countries never achieved the massive support that Hitler had gained. And in the fourth place, constant surveillance by intelligence agencies and Nazi hunter groups hindered the activities of the exiles. Simon Wiesenthal, the Israeli Mossad, the Klasfelds, and others dedicated decades to tracking down and exposing Nazi war criminals. This constant pressure kept the fugitives on the defensive and limited their ability to organize politically. However, it would be a mistake to completely underestimate the influence of the Nazi legacy in the post-war period. Nazi ideas, though not their specific political organization, survived and continued to evolve. Anti-Semitism, pseudo-scientific racism, authoritarian ultranationalism, hostility toward liberal democracy, all these elements found new expressions in different movements and countries. And what is perhaps more disturbing, some of the more practical aspects of the Nazi project did survive and were adopted by others. The propaganda techniques developed by Goebbels were studied and adapted by authoritarian regimes around the world. The social control methods employed by the SAS inspired security forces in subsequent dictatorships. The engineering of mass deportations and concentration camps was replicated, with variations in places like Cambodia, the former Yugoslavia, and other subsequent genocide scenarios. In this sense, the Nazi survival plan was successful, although not in the way its architects had imagined. The specific political movement was not reborn, but its ideas and methods spread and were perpetuated in ways that are often subtle and difficult to detect. Let us return now to the chronology of events, because there are aspects of the final days that we have not yet examined in detail. The month of April of 1945 was, for the inhabitants of Hitler's bunker, a gradual descent into the apocalypse. The news arriving from the front was increasingly catastrophic. The Soviet army had completely surrounded Berlin. The German units that were supposedly coming to rescue the capital did not exist or were too weakened to fight effectively. Supplies were running low, and over the city fell a constant rain of bombs and artillery shells. In this context, the atmosphere inside the bunker oscillated between delusional denial and absolute despair. Hitler alternated between moments of irrational hope, convinced that some miraculous turn would reverse the situation, and fits of rage during which he blamed his generals, his allies, and the German people for the catastrophe. Survivor testimonies describe scenes that seem taken from a theatre of the absurd. Hitler drew battle plans on maps with units that no longer existed. He ordered impossible counteroffensives with imaginary troops. He celebrated fictitious victories while the Soviet army advanced block by block toward his position. Was this genuine madness, or was there a method behind the apparent dementia? Some historians have suggested that Hitler deliberately maintained the appearances of normality to hide his true plans. If he was preparing an escape, he needed his closest subordinates to believe he intended to die fighting until the end. The image of the leader who refuses to abandon his post was essential to maintain the morale of the troops still resisting outside while the world collapsed around them. Was all this an elaborate theatrical performance? Was Hitler playing a role while others prepared his escape? This question remains without a definitive answer 80 years later. But there is a detail that deserves special attention. In the days before the 30th of April, several planes landed and took off from an improvised strip on Berlin's East-West Avenue, known as the Ost-West-Achse. This wide avenue, designed by Albert Speer as part of the megalomaniacal reconstruction of the capital, became an emergency airfield in the final days of the Reich. Pilots from the secret unit KG-200 performed risky flights under enemy fire, evacuating high-ranking individuals from the heart of the besieged city. Who was evacuated on those flights? The records are incomplete. Some passengers were subsequently identified. Others remain a mystery. And here a disturbing coincidence arises. Captain Peter Baumgart, a pilot for that secret unit, declared in a Polish court in 1947 that he had personally flown Hitler out of Berlin. According to his testimony, he transported the dictator to Denmark, where a submarine waited to continue the journey to South America. Why would a pilot confess such a thing if it were not true? What could he gain by lying about such a matter before a court that was judging him for war crimes? Skeptics argue that Baumgart might have invented the story to obtain more favourable treatment from his captors. But others point out that the testimony included specific details about the route taken and the circumstances of the flight that would have been difficult to fabricate. And Baumgart was not the only one. Hans Bauer, Hitler's personal pilot, survived the war and was extensively interrogated by the Soviets. His official testimony supports the suicide version. However, subsequent researchers have pointed out inconsistencies in his statements and have speculated about what he might have omitted under pressure. Let us stop here to consider the magnitude of what we are exploring. It is not simply about determining if Hitler died in his bunker or escaped. It is about understanding how great historical deceptions work, how the powerful can manipulate the truth, and how official versions of events can be constructed to serve specific political interests. The technique of creating a curiosity gap, that space between what we know and what we need to know, is as old as storytelling itself. Nazi architects of deception understood this principle perfectly. They knew that if they provided a sufficiently credible story about Hitler's death, the world would accept it because it needed to accept it. The war was over. People wanted to move on. No one wished to contemplate the possibility that history's greatest criminal was walking free in the world. And so the official narrative was built. Carefully selected witnesses provided consistent statements. The Soviets, for reasons only they fully knew, kept silent about the evidence they had found, and the world moved on, convinced that Hitler was dead and buried. But the gaps in that story never completely closed. Like small cracks in a dam, they allowed doubts to seep through decade after decade. Let us advance now toward one of the most fascinating and least known aspects of the Nazi survival plan, the preparation of doubles and the staging of the death. The existence of Hitler doubles is historically documented. The regime employed several individuals trained to impersonate the dictator in situations considered too dangerous for the original. These doubles were selected for their physical resemblance and subjected to months of training to imitate Hitler's gestures, posture, and characteristic mannerisms. According to researcher Gerard Williams, co-author of the book Grey Wolf, everything was planned to the last detail, including the clothing the doubles would wear, who would eventually pass themselves off as the corpses of Hitler and Eva Braun. This claim, though controversial, raises disturbing questions. If the Nazis had foreseen the need to provide bodies to confirm Hitler's death, does this not suggest that the escape was planned long before? Preparation for the deception would have required extraordinary coordination. The doubles would have to be available in the bunker at the precise moment. The witnesses who would subsequently testify to the Soviets would have to know their role and be willing to maintain the lie under interrogation. And those in charge of burning the bodies would have to do it completely enough to prevent identification, but not so completely as to arouse suspicion. Is this plausible? Critics argue that a deception of such magnitude would have been impossible to maintain. Too many people would have been involved. Someone would have talked. The truth would have come to light sooner or later. But let us consider how long other Nazi secrets were kept. The existence of the extermination camps was hidden from the German people for years. The euthanasia operations that killed hundreds of thousands of disabled people were kept secret until well into the war. The German nuclear weapons project remains partially shrouded in mystery to this day. If the Nazis could keep these secrets, why could they not have kept one more? And there is another factor that deserves consideration. After the war, the primary witnesses of Hitler's final days were divided between Soviet and Western captivity. The Soviets did not share information with their former allies and vice versa. This fragmentation of knowledge made it extremely difficult to reconstruct a complete picture of what had really happened. Let us return to the chronology. On the 29th of April, 1945, Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief civil ceremony held in the bunker. Why marry when he supposedly planned to commit suicide the next day? The conventional explanation is that Hitler wanted to give Eva the status of a legitimate wife before dying together, but there is another possible interpretation. If Hitler planned to escape, the marriage could serve practical purposes. A wife could inherit properties and assets. She could travel with documents indicating her marital status. And in the conservative society of the time, a married couple attracted less attention than an unmarried couple traveling together. Immediately after the marriage, Hitler dictated his political and personal will. In the political will, he blamed the Jews for the war and exhorted Germans to continue the fight against the international poisoner of all peoples. In the personal will, he left his possessions to his relatives and the Nazi Party. Curiously, the will made specific reference to his intention to commit suicide. "I and my wife choose death to escape the shame of defeat or capitulation," he wrote. Was this a genuine declaration of intent, or was it part of the elaborate staging designed to convince the world that Hitler was dead? Researchers who support the survival theory point out that the will could have been drafted precisely to establish the alibi. If Hitler escaped and the will was found, it would provide documentary evidence of his supposed suicide. It was in a sense the script for the theatrical play that was about to be performed. On the 30th of April, according to the official version, Hitler had lunch with his secretaries and other members of the bunker staff. Around 3:30 in the afternoon, he retired to his private rooms with Eva. Shortly after, a shot was heard. When the aides entered, they found Hitler dead with a gunshot wound to the right temple and Eva also dead, apparently from cyanide poisoning. But here the first inconsistencies arise. Some witnesses reported hearing one shot, others said there were two. Some described Hitler's body slumped on a sofa. Others placed it on the floor. The exact position of the gun varied according to the witness. These contradictory details could be explained by the chaos of the moment and memory failures under stress, or they could indicate that the witnesses were reciting a story they had not actually witnessed. The bodies were taken to the Chancellery Garden and burned with gasoline. The cremation process lasted several hours. When it ended, the remains were buried in a nearby bomb crater. All this happened while the Soviet army was just a few hundred meters away, fighting for every building. Why take the trouble to burn the bodies in those desperate circumstances? The official explanation is that Hitler had ordered that his remains not fall into the hands of the enemy. He did not want his body to be exhibited as a trophy, as had happened with Mussolini just days before in Italy. This explanation is plausible, but it is also convenient. Burning the bodies made subsequent identification practically impossible, and if the burned bodies were not really Hitler and Eva, but carefully prepared doubles, cremation was essential to hide the deception. The Soviets arrived at the bunker on the 2nd of May, 1945. They found a chaotic scene of destruction and suicides. Multiple Nazi officials had followed their leader's example, taking their own lives rather than surrendering. Among the bodies were several that superficially resembled Hitler. The SMERSH unit, the Soviet counterintelligence service, was tasked with investigating. Its agents exhumed multiple bodies from the Chancellery Garden, trying to identify which corresponded to Hitler. The process was complicated by the state of the remains and the confusion of the moment. Eventually, the Soviets claimed to have identified Hitler's remains based primarily on his dental records. A dental technician and an assistant who had worked with Hitler's personal dentist were located and forced to examine the recovered jaw fragments. They confirmed that they matched Hitler's records. This dental identification became the cornerstone of the official version. But it presents its own problems. Hitler's original dental records were never found. The identifications were based on the memories of people working under the pressure of their Soviet captors, and the chain of custody of the remains was, at best, deficient. More problematic still, the Soviets did not share this evidence with their Western allies. For years, they maintained mystery about what they had actually found. Stalin, as we already mentioned, publicly expressed doubts about Hitler's death at the Potsdam Conference, just weeks after the supposed suicide. Why would he do this if the Soviets had conclusive evidence of the death? One possibility is that Stalin was playing political games, using the uncertainty about Hitler as a tool of pressure against the Western allies. Another possibility, more disturbing, is that Stalin genuinely was not convinced that Hitler was dead. Declassified FBI documents add another layer of complexity to this story. In September of 1945, just 4 months after the end of the war in Europe, the FBI received a detailed report on the supposed arrival of Hitler in Argentina. The informant claimed that Hitler had disembarked from a submarine on the Argentine Atlantic coast and was being transported toward a remote location in the foothills of the Andes. The FBI took this report seriously enough to open a formal investigation. Agents contacted Argentine authorities, who predictably denied any knowledge. But the investigation continued, and in the following years, dozens of additional reports arrived about sightings of Hitler in various South American countries. What is particularly striking is that these reports did not come only from eccentrics or attention seekers. Some came from sources the FBI considered reliable: diplomats, intelligence officials, businessmen with connections in the German community of Argentina. Not all these reports could be dismissed as fantasies. What did the researchers find when they followed these leads? In some cases, nothing concrete. In others, they discovered disturbing circumstantial evidence: remote properties in Patagonia that were under armed surveillance, closed German communities where outsiders were not welcome, testimonies from locals who claimed to have seen an elderly German man whose description matched Hitler's. One of the properties most frequently mentioned in these investigations was an isolated mansion by a lake in the Bariloche region. This area, known for its natural beauty and its alpine climate, had been colonized by German immigrants since the end of the 19th century. During the post-war period, it became a refuge for multiple Nazi war criminals. Erich Priebke lived there for decades. Josef Mengele spent time in the region before moving to other countries. Why could Hitler himself not have taken refuge there as well? Researchers from the television series Hunting Hitler visited this mansion decades later. They found a structure that matched the descriptions in FBI reports: remote location, difficult access, capacity to house a small retinue. Local investigations revealed that the property had belonged to families of German origin with known connections to the Nazi regime. Of course, finding a mansion that could have housed Hitler is not the same as proving that it actually did. The evidence remains circumstantial, but the pattern of findings, repeated in multiple locations and documented in multiple independent reports, suggests that something was happening in those remote German communities of South America. Let us now examine the escape routes in greater detail, because if Hitler indeed fled, he had to follow some path from Berlin to his final destination, and researchers have identified several possibilities. The first and most direct would be the air route from Berlin to some point out of Allied reach. As we already mentioned, planes continued taking off and landing on the improvised Ost-West Axis strip until the final days of the siege. Pilots of the secret KG-200 unit flew extraordinarily dangerous missions crossing the airspace dominated by the Soviets. According to Captain Baumgart's testimony, Hitler was evacuated in a small plane to Denmark. From there, he would have been transported to a submarine waiting in some Baltic seaport. This submarine would have taken him across the Atlantic to the Argentine coast. This route presents significant logistical problems. In April of 1945, the airspace over Germany was completely dominated by Allied aviation. Any German plane taking off risked being shot down. and Denmark, although still nominally under German control, was being rapidly occupied by British forces. However, it was not impossible. Darkness, bad weather, and the confusion of the final days of the war provided opportunities for clandestine flights, and the pilots of KG-200 were specialists in high-risk missions. They had been specifically selected for their skill and their willingness to assume extreme risks. The second possibility would be a land route toward the south, crossing Bavaria and Austria toward Italy. This was the route used by most Nazi fugitives who escaped after the war. It passed through the Brenner Pass, crossed the Italian Alps, and led to ports like Genoa, from where it was possible to embark for Spain or directly for South America. The difficulty with this route is that it would have required crossing territories increasingly controlled by Allied forces. In April and May of 1945, American, British and French armies were converging over southern Germany and Austria. Road checkpoints multiplied, and Hitler's face was probably the most recognizable in the world at that moment. To use this route successfully, Hitler would have needed to disguise himself effectively, have impeccable false documentation, and have a support network that would provide him with safe lodging at each stage of the journey. All this was possible, but it required extensive preparation. The third possibility, and perhaps the most audacious, would be a direct evacuation by submarine from some port in northern Germany. In the final days of the war, multiple German submarines set sail for unknown destinations. Some surrendered weeks or months later in distant ports, and others disappeared without a trace. Submarines U-530 and U-977, which surrendered in Argentina in July and August of 1945 respectively, are the most famous cases. Their commanders claimed they simply wanted to avoid falling into Allied hands in Europe. But interrogations revealed inconsistencies in their stories. The travel times reported did not coincide with normal navigation speeds. This suggests they made intermediate stops that they never satisfactorily explained. Was Hitler a passenger in one of these submarines, or in some other that was never located? There is no direct evidence to confirm it, but the possibility cannot be ruled out based solely on the lack of evidence. There is another aspect of the escape routes that deserves attention: the Canary Islands. This Spanish archipelago, located off the coast of West Africa, was territory of Francisco Franco, the Spanish dictator who maintained close ties with the Nazi regime. According to some testimonies, the Canaries served as a stopover point on the route to South America. Researchers have discovered secret German tunnels and complexes in the Canary Islands dating from the war era. These complexes would have provided safe refuge for fugitives in transit toward the South Atlantic. And from the Canaries, the submarine crossing to Argentina was relatively direct, following favourable ocean currents. According to one of the testimonies gathered in the investigations, Hitler first flew to Spain, where General Franco provided him with a plane to travel to the Canary Islands. From there, he boarded a submarine that took him to the Argentine coast, disembarking approximately 480 kilometres south of Buenos Aires. This account is extraordinarily specific. It includes details about routes, distances, and transport methods that would have been difficult to invent, but it is also impossible to verify directly after so many decades. What would Hitler have found upon arriving in Argentina, if he indeed arrived? A country that, under the government of Juan Domingo Perón, had become a systematic refuge for Nazi fugitives. Post-war Argentine migration policies were specifically designed to attract Europeans considered desirable, a category that included many Germans regardless of their political past. The Perón government not only tolerated the presence of Nazis, it actively encouraged it. Argentine agents operated in Europe identifying potential emigrants with useful technical skills. Visas were issued with suspicious speed, and once in Argentina, the newcomers found an established German community willing to help them integrate. This host infrastructure did not arise spontaneously. It was deliberately created with significant financing whose origin has been the subject of speculation for decades. Where did that money come from? One possibility is that it was the Nazi funds transferred abroad by Martin Bormann and others before the end of the war. Calculations on the magnitude of these transferred funds vary enormously. Some estimates speak of hundreds of millions of dollars. Others suggest even higher figures. What seems clear is that the Nazi regime, anticipating possible defeat, took systematic measures to preserve its financial resources beyond the reach of the Allies. These resources would have provided the means to maintain high-profile fugitives for years or decades. Remote properties, security personnel, high-quality false documents, bribes to local officials, All this required money, and apparently there was money in abundance. But beyond material resources, what kind of existence would Hitler have led in exile? This question takes us into the terrain of psychological speculation, but it is an informed speculation based on what we know about the dictator's personality. Hitler was, according to all accounts, an extraordinarily narcissistic person. His sense of personal importance was immeasurable. He genuinely believed he was a historical figure destined to transform the world. Living in anonymity, hidden in some remote property in Patagonia, would have been profoundly contrary to his nature. How would he have managed this contradiction? One possibility is that he maintained a small court of devoted followers who provided him with the admiration he needed. These followers would have treated the elderly fugitive as if he were still the all-powerful Führer, creating a bubble of unreality where Hitler could continue to feel important. Another possibility is that Hitler suffered severe psychological deterioration as a result of his new situation. The combination of defeat, exile, and forced anonymity could have been devastating for someone with his personality structure. Reports on his health in the final months of the war already indicated symptoms of depression and possibly cognitive decline. These problems would probably have worsened in exile. There are testimonies from people who claim to have seen an old man identified as Hitler in Argentina during the 50s and 60s. These witnesses described an aged, stooped figure, very different from the charismatic leader who had hypnotized millions. If these testimonies were genuine, they suggest that exile had profoundly transformed Hitler, turning him into a shadow of what he had been. When would Hitler have died if he indeed survived the war? The most frequent speculations place his death sometime between the mid-60s and the early 70s. He would then have been between 75 and 85 years old, an advanced but not impossible age for the time. Parkinson's disease, if that was indeed his diagnosis, something that continues to be debated among medical historians, is progressive and incapacitating. In the final stages, patients are severely limited in their mobility and cognitive functions. A Hitler in the advanced stages of Parkinson's would have required constant medical care and would have been incapable of any significant activity. Curiously, reports of Hitler sightings in South America become scarcer starting in the mid-60s. This could simply be due to public interest in the subject diminishing over time. Or it could indicate that the person some identified as Hitler had died or had become completely secluded due to his physical deterioration. What happened to Eva Braun in this hypothetical scenario? If she indeed escaped along with Hitler, she would have been only 33 years old at the end of the war. She was a relatively young woman without a significant public profile. Her existence was unknown to most Germans, and therefore much easier to hide than Hitler himself. Some testimonies mention the presence of a woman next to the supposed Hitler in Argentina. The descriptions are vague, but they coincide in pointing out a middle-aged blonde woman who accompanied the elderly German. Was it Eva? Or was it another person, perhaps a later caretaker or companion? And there is another even more disturbing question. Did Hitler and Eva have offspring? Some researchers have speculated that Eva could have been pregnant at the end of the war, or that the couple had children in exile. No credible evidence exists to confirm these speculations, but the possibility has fueled theories about possible heirs of the Nazi legacy living currently somewhere in the world. Let us return now to a fundamental question. Why does all this matter? Why should we care about what happened to Hitler 8 decades ago? The answer has multiple dimensions. In the first place, it matters because historical truth matters in itself. The victims of Nazism, the millions who died in the Holocaust, deserve to know if the primary architect of their suffering faced some form of justice or if he escaped to live quietly until old age. In the second place, it matters because it reveals the limits of power and justice. If Hitler indeed escaped and the Allied powers could not or would not capture him, that says something disturbing about the capacity of the powerful to evade the consequences of their actions, even when those actions constitute the worst crimes in history. In the third place, it matters because the myths about Hitler's survival have been used by neo-Nazi movements to maintain an obscene hope. If Hitler died in his bunker as a coward, that constitutes a lesson on the fate of tyrants. But if he escaped and lived decades more, some interpret that as a symbolic victory for Nazism, as evidence that the movement was more powerful and more astute than its enemies recognized. And in the fourth place, it matters because it teaches us about the nature of historical evidence and the limits of our knowledge. We think we know what happened at the end of the Second World War, but when we examine the evidence critically, we discover that there is much more uncertainty than we normally acknowledge. This epistemological humility is valuable. In an era of disinformation and alternative facts, it is important to remember that even the most documented historical events can be surrounded by uncertainty. It is not about concluding that everything is relative or that truth does not exist. It is about recognizing that the search for truth is a continuous process, not a final destination. What is, then, the conclusion of all this investigation? After examining declassified documents, witness testimonies, investigations from multiple intelligence agencies, and circumstantial evidence from diverse sources, what can we state with certainty? We can state that elaborate plans existed for the evacuation of Nazi leaders before the end of the war. These plans are documented. The escape routes worked. Thousands of war criminals indeed escaped using them. We can state that the evidence of Hitler's death in the bunker is less conclusive than is generally assumed. The remains were never independently examined by Western experts. The testimonies of the survivors, though consistent, come from people who were in situations of extreme pressure. And the Soviets, who controlled the physical evidence, were never transparent about what they had found. We can state that serious intelligence agencies, including the FBI, considered the possibility of Hitler's survival plausible enough to investigate it for years. This does not mean they believed Hitler was alive, it means they were not sure he was dead. And we can state that Argentina and other South American countries provided systematic refuge to fugitive Nazis, including some of the most wanted criminals in the world. If these criminals could escape and live for decades without being detected, the possibility that Hitler did the same cannot be dismissed simply as fantasy. What we cannot state is that Hitler definitively escaped. The evidence, though intriguing, remains circumstantial. No document, photograph, or irrefutable testimony exists that demonstrates his presence in Argentina or anywhere else after April of 1945. Official history, despite its problems, remains the most probable explanation. Hitler probably died in his bunker on the 30th of April, 1945, just as the witnesses reported. The escape plans existed, but they were probably not executed in his particular case. The combination of his physical deterioration, his mental state, and his sense of Germanic duty probably led him to choose death over flight. But probably is not the same as certainly. And as long as reasonable doubts exist, the question of Hitler's final fate will continue to fascinate historians, researchers, and the general public. What do you think after examining all this evidence? Do you believe Hitler died in his bunker as the official history says? Or do you believe there is a real possibility that he escaped and lived additional years in anonymity? Tell us in the comments. But before you answer, there are still more aspects of this story that we must explore. Because the Nazi survival plan was not limited to the person of Hitler. It was a much broader project involving the preservation of the movement, its ideas, and its resources for an eventual resurrection. And what we will discover next is perhaps even more disturbing than any theory about the personal fate of the dictator. Because while the world celebrated the end of the war, in the shadows a network was being woven that would connect fugitive Nazis with the power structures of the post-war period in ways we are only beginning to understand. The concept of the Fourth Reich was not a post-war fantasy. It was a deliberate plan, designed by the most astute strategists of the Nazi regime, to ensure that military defeat did not mean the end of the movement. Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal secretary and administrator of the Nazi Party, was the main architect of this plan. Unlike other Nazi leaders who sought public glory, Bormann operated in the shadows, accumulating real power while others dealt with ceremonies and speeches. And it was precisely this preference for discretion that made him the ideal person to direct the survival operation. Starting in 1943, when the tide of the war began to turn definitively against Germany after the defeats of Stalingrad and Kursk, Bormann systematically began the transfer of Nazi assets abroad. Gold, currency, works of art, industrial patents, technical documents, everything was channeled towards Swiss banks, shell corporations in neutral countries, and secret accounts in South America. The magnitude of this transfer of assets remains partially unknown. Estimates vary from hundreds of millions to billions of dollars in current values. What we know for certain is that at the end of the war, a significant portion of the wealth of the Reich had disappeared, out of the reach of the Allies. These funds were not intended simply to enrich fugitive individuals. They were the seed capital for the continuation of the Nazi project under new forms. Planners anticipated that tensions between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union would eventually lead to a new conflict. In that scenario, a reorganized Nazi movement could emerge as a relevant actor, offering its combat experience against communism in exchange for political legitimacy. This strategy was cynical, but not entirely unrealistic. The Cold War effectively began almost immediately after the Second World War, and Western policy toward former Nazis evolved rapidly from the relentless pursuit of Nuremberg toward a pragmatism that prioritized anti-communist utility over historical justice. Operation Paperclip, for example, brought more than 1,500 German scientists and technicians to the United States, many of them with compromised Nazi pasts. Werner von Braun, the father of the American space program, had been a member of the Nazi Party and an SS officer. His V-2 rockets had been built by slave laborers in concentration camps, but after the war he was received as a valuable resource, his past conveniently forgotten. If the United States was willing to employ Nazi scientists when it suited its Cold War interests, what other compromises could have been made? This question has haunted historians for decades. Documentary evidence exists that the CIA and its predecessor organizations employed former Nazis as intelligence agents. Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, worked for American intelligence services for years before escaping to Bolivia with the help of the agency itself. Reinhard Gehlen, head of German intelligence on the Eastern Front, was incorporated directly into the Western intelligence structure after the war, bringing many of his Nazi subordinates with him. These collaborations were not secret at the time, they were deliberate policies justified by the exigencies of the Cold War, but their broader implications remain partially hidden. To what extent did these networks of former Nazis infiltrate Western power structures? What influence did they have on post-war policy? And what did Western agencies know about the whereabouts of high-profile fugitives they were supposedly seeking? The case of Adolf Eichmann is illustrative. Eichmann, the logistical organizer of the Holocaust, lived in Argentina under a false identity for more than a decade. His presence there was known to the intelligence services of several countries, including West Germany. However, no Western government took measures to capture him. It was the Israeli Mossad, operating unilaterally, who finally kidnapped him in 1960 and brought him to trial in Jerusalem. Why did Western governments not act against Eichmann when they knew where he was? Explanations vary. Some argue there were complicated diplomatic considerations related to Argentina. Others suggest certain officials wanted to maintain the cooperation of former Nazis for intelligence operations. And still others speculate about uncomfortable connections that certain governments preferred not to expose. If this happened with Eichmann, what could have happened with even more prominent figures? But let us return to the chronology of events to examine some additional details that deserve attention. In the weeks immediately following the end of the war in Europe, there were a series of unexplained incidents suggesting that something extraordinary was happening. German submarines appeared in distant ports weeks after the official surrender. Unidentified planes were reported on transoceanic routes, and testimonies from Allied personnel mentioned suspicious convoys moving towards southern Europe. One of these incidents involved the submarine U-234, which surrendered to American forces in May of 1945. On board was an extraordinary cargo, more than 500 kilograms of uranium oxide, infrared detonators, and technical documents related to advanced weapons programs. The submarine was originally headed for Japan, the last Axis ally. What other submarines with similar cargoes could have reached different destinations? Another incident involved the mysterious disappearance of the Amber Room, the famous amber chamber that the Nazis had looted from the Catherine Palace in Russia. This invaluable treasure disappeared in the final days of the war and was never recovered. Was it destroyed in the bombings? Or was it evacuated to some unknown destination as part of the broader operation to preserve Nazi assets? And then there are the reports on advanced technologies that were supposedly developed by the Nazi regime and evacuated before the surrender. Jet planes, guided missiles, even, according to the most extreme theories, anti-gravity devices. These technologies would have represented enormous value for any power that possessed them. What happened to the engineers and scientists who developed them? And what happened to the prototypes and technical documents? Not all these questions can be answered. But their existence reveals the magnitude of what we do not know about the final days of the Third Reich and the fate of its resources. Let us now consider the perspective from the other side, the Allies who were supposedly looking for Nazi fugitives. How serious was this search really? And were there moments when the hunters decided to look the other way? Evidence suggests that Allied commitment to the pursuit of war criminals fluctuated significantly over time. In the months immediately following the war, there was a genuine effort to identify and punish those responsible for Nazi atrocities. The Nuremberg trials represented the high point of this effort, establishing principles of international justice that remain relevant today. But as the Cold War intensified, priorities changed. The Soviet threat eclipsed everything else, and former enemies began to look like potential allies in the new ideological conflict. By 1948, barely 3 years after the end of the war, the denazification program in West Germany had been effectively abandoned. Thousands of Nazi officials returned to positions of responsibility in the government, the judiciary, the armed forces, and industry. The past was forgiven, if not forgotten, in the name of stability and reconstruction. This change of attitude had direct consequences for the search for fugitives. The resources dedicated to locating them decreased. Diplomatic pressures on countries harbouring them relaxed. And in some cases, as documented by subsequent researchers, there was active obstruction of justice efforts. The writer and Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal dedicated decades to documenting these failures. His investigations revealed how government agencies had protected war criminals, how corrupt officials had sold false documents, and how an entire infrastructure of impunity had allowed thousands to escape the consequences of their crimes. If the system allowed lower-ranking criminals to escape routinely, what additional protection would have been available for the most important figure of all? This question brings us to consider the most disturbing possibility of all, that Hitler's survival, if it indeed occurred, could have been tolerated or even facilitated by some faction of the Allies. Why would they do such a thing? Hypothetical explanations vary. Some suggest that a sick and defeated Hitler no longer represented a real threat, and that exposing him would have created more problems than it solved. A trial of Hitler would have been extraordinarily complex and politically divisive. What would it reveal about collaborators in neutral countries? What uncomfortable connections would investigations expose? And how would the world handle the spectacle of judging history's greatest criminal? Others suggest more cynical motivations. A living Hitler could be a valuable intelligence asset, a source of information on hidden Nazi operations, fugitive networks, and hidden resources. His cooperation could be bought in exchange for tolerance toward his exile. And still others speculate about broader political compromises. In the confusion of the final days of the war, what deals could have been made? What promises were exchanged? And what secrets remain sealed in classified archives that will not be opened for generations? These are speculations, not statements of fact. No direct documentary evidence exists that any Allied power deliberately facilitated Hitler's flight. But speculation is useful because it forces us to consider possibilities that the official narrative conveniently excludes. Let us advance now toward a broader reflection on the meaning of all this. Hitler's secret plan to survive defeat was not simply a personal matter. It was the maximum expression of a defining trait of Nazism, the denial of reality when it contradicted the leader's will. Throughout his entire political career, Hitler demonstrated an extraordinary capacity to ignore inconvenient facts. When his prophecies were not fulfilled, he rewrote history. When his decisions failed, he blamed subordinates. And when reality threatened to impose itself, he doubled down on his bet, convinced that willpower could triumph over objective circumstances. This mentality was disastrous for Germany and the world. It led to catastrophic military decisions, to a war unnecessarily prolonged, and to an apocalyptic end that left the country in ruins and millions of people dead. But it also meant that Hitler was psychologically incapable of accepting defeat in conventional terms. He could not simply surrender and face the consequences. He had to find some way to redefine the situation, to transform defeat into something different, a strategic retreat, a heroic martyrdom, or perhaps a flight toward a new beginning. The survival plan in this interpretation was not simply a practical attempt to avoid capture, it was the manifestation of a deeper pathology, the inability to confront reality even when it was irrefutable. And here there is a lesson for our own time, because the denial of reality did not die with Hitler. It continues to manifest itself in authoritarian leaders, in populist movements, in conspiracy theories, and in the rejection of established facts when they prove uncomfortable. The temptation to create alternative narratives, to insist that things are as we want them to be rather than as they really are, is profoundly human. And the study of Nazism, including its pathetic final days, reminds us where that temptation can lead when taken to its logical extremes. Does this mean we should simply accept the official version of Hitler's death and stop asking questions? Not at all. Asking questions, questioning established narratives, demanding evidence, these are the fundamental tools of critical thinking. But we must use these tools responsibly, distinguishing between legitimate skepticism and conspiratorial denialism. The difference is crucial. Legitimate skepticism examines available evidence, identifies inconsistencies and limitations, and maintains provisional conclusions subject to revision. Conspiratorial denialism, in contrast, rejects evidence that contradicts its prejudices, invents ad hoc explanations for every objection, and clings to predetermined conclusions independent of the facts. In the case of Hitler's death, legitimate skepticism recognizes that the evidence is imperfect, but that the official version remains the most probable explanation. Conspiratorial denialism insists that Hitler definitely escaped based on unverified speculations and by dismissing contrary evidence. Why did Perón act like that? The explanations are multiple and revealing. In the first place, an ideological affinity existed. Perón admired certain aspects of European fascism and had spent time in Italy during the 30s observing Mussolini's regime. Although he was not a Nazi in the strict sense, he shared with fascism a corporatist vision of society and a distrust toward democratic liberalism. In the second place, there were pragmatic considerations. German scientists, engineers, and technicians represented a valuable resource for a country aspiring to industrialization and modernization. Argentina was building its own aeronautical and military industry, and German experts could contribute significantly to these projects. In the third place, there was money. Lots of money. Nazi funds transferred abroad flowed to Argentina through opaque banking channels. These funds financed not only the lives of the fugitives, but also projects that benefited the Argentine government. Corruption oiled the gears of the entire system. And in the fourth place, there was a tradition of political asylum that Argentina used selectively. The country presented itself as a refuge for the politically persecuted, although this generosity was applied very differently depending on who was being persecuted. According to recent investigations, up to 9,000 Nazi war criminals and their collaborators escaped to South America using the rat lines. Of these, approximately 5,000 settled in Argentina, 2,000 in Brazil, and 1,000 in Chile. Some integrated into local society pretending to be farmers or devout Catholics. But let us stop here to consider a crucial question. If so many lower-ranking Nazis managed to escape, what level of protection would have been available for the Reich's leader himself? Declassified documents from the FBI and the CIA reveal something extraordinary. In 1945, the American naval attaché in Buenos Aires informed Washington that a high probability existed that Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun had just arrived in Argentina. This report coincided with the sightings of submarine U-530. As additional evidence, newspaper articles were mentioned detailing the construction of a Bavarian-style mansion in the foothills of the Andes. A Bavarian-style mansion built precisely when Hitler had supposedly just died. The coincidence is disturbing. According to reports received by the FB1, Hitler supposedly arrived in Argentina and stayed first at the San Ramon Ranch, east of San Carlos de Bariloche. Subsequently, he moved to a Bavarian-style mansion in Inalco, a remote and barely accessible place at the northwestern tip of Lake Nahuel Huapi, near the border with Chile. Bob Baer, a former CIA agent who investigated this case for years, recently stated that the official version of history, where Hitler committed suicide in Berlin on the 30th of April, 1945, might need to be reconsidered once evidence he describes as explosive is published. Much money was spent on a complex with plumbing and electricity in the middle of nowhere, Baer explained. He added that Nazi objects were found, including German coins from the Second World War era, in the area. If you wanted to hide Hitler, that is the place where you would do it, he stated. This revelation gains more weight when we consider that high-profile Nazi figures, including Adolf Eichmann and Josef Mengele, indeed fled to Argentina. If the architect of genocide and the infamous doctor of Auschwitz could escape and live for years without being detected, why could the ultimate leader not have done so as well? But let us return to the submarines, because their story is fundamental to understanding how the escape could have been executed. The submarine U-530 surrendered to the Argentine Navy in Mar del Plata on the 10th of July, 1945. Its captain, Otto Vermuth, insisted that he was not carrying passengers. However, Argentine interrogators noted that he admitted to destroying the submarine's logbook and secret documents, while consistently refusing to provide details on the specific routes taken. Subsequently, newspaper articles suggested that an Argentine reporter claimed to have seen a provincial police report that supposedly documented the strange disembarkation of a high-ranking official and a civilian from a submarine. It was even suggested that the couple could be Hitler and Eva Braun in disguise. Approximately 1 month later, on the 17th of August, 1945, another submarine, the U-977, appeared in Mar del Plata. The crew explained to interrogators that after realizing the war had ended in May, they headed for Argentina, hoping to avoid falling into the hands of the Russians and perhaps even settle in South America without being sent to a prisoner of war camp. Captain Heinz Schaefer subsequently wrote a book about the trip. According to his version, the submarine performed a continuous submerged passage using the schnorkel from the 10th of May to the 14th of July, 1945, 66 days underwater. It was the second longest submerged voyage of the entire war. Why would a submarine need to remain submerged for more than 2 months if it was simply transporting its crew toward exile? This question never received a satisfactory answer. But there is another submarine whose story is even more intriguing, the U-3523. This submarine belonged to a new generation of Type 21 submarines, capable of sailing more silently and remaining submerged longer than any of its predecessors. Its range would have allowed it to sail non-stop from Europe to South America. As such, it would have been the perfect escape vehicle for Nazi gold, high-ranking officials, or even Hitler himself as the Reich collapsed. The crew of a British B-24 Liberator bomber reported having sunk the submarine on the 6th of May, 1945. However, the remains were never found, fueling suspicions that the submarine, and whoever it carried, could have escaped toward Argentina. For 73 years, the fate of the U-3523 remained shrouded in mystery. Finally, in 2018, researchers from the Sea War Museum, Jutland, Denmark, announced they had discovered the remains of the submarine in the Skagerrak Strait, 10 nautical miles north of the Danish city of Skagen. The discovery seemed to prove that the U-3523 never carried Hitler, any Nazi, or any treasure to Argentina. The reason it remained undiscovered for so many decades was that the Liberator bomber crew made an error in reporting its position, placing the remains 9 nautical miles east of where it actually sank. But, intriguingly, the researchers also pointed out that the U-3523 was probably on the run when the Liberator interrupted its escape, and they still do not know for certain who was on board when the submarine sank. The day before, German forces in Denmark, northwestern Germany, and the Netherlands had surrendered, and the submarine was not on a war patrol, but probably in flight, declared the Sea War Museum. Where was it fleeing to? Who was on board besides the 58 crew members who perished at 123 meters deep? The last telegram sent by the submarine on the 5th of May 1945 did not mention Nazi treasure or officials. The mystery remains partially unsolved. The submarine lies under 123 meters of water, and the museum has no plans to refloat it. Until this changes, the enigma of who really travelled in those submarines will remain sealed in the depths of the North Sea. But beyond the submarines, there exists another crucial piece of this puzzle: the forensic evidence on Hitler's death. What did the Soviets really find in the bunker? And why have their findings been the subject of so much controversy? In May of 1945, the Soviets found a fragment of a jaw and 2 dental bridges in the Reich Chancellery Garden. These were shown to 2 associates of Hitler's personal dentist Hugo Blaschke, his assistant Katte Häusermann, and dental technician Fritz Echtmann. Both identified the remains as belonging to Hitler. This dental identification became the cornerstone of the official version. But there are significant problems with this evidence. In the first place, Hitler's original dental records were never found. The identifications were based on the memories of people working under the extreme pressure of their Soviet captors. How reliable are memories under such circumstances? In the second place, the chain of custody of the remains was, at best, deficient. The Soviets controlled all the evidence and never allowed Western experts to examine it independently. In the third place, and perhaps most disturbing, subsequent analyses of some skull fragments that the Soviets claimed belonged to Hitler revealed that they actually belonged to a woman. This discovery, published in 2009, caused a small commotion, though it was downplayed by other historians. And here we come to one of the most fascinating aspects of this entire story: the Soviet disinformation campaign. The narrative that Hitler did not commit suicide but rather escaped from Berlin was first presented to the general public by Marshal Georgy Zhukov at a press conference on the 9th of June 1945, following direct orders from the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin. That month, 68% of Americans surveyed believed that Hitler was still alive. Why would Stalin order the spread of information that contradicted what his own researchers were discovering? Explanations vary. Some historians suggest that Stalin wanted to maintain an element of uncertainty to pressure the Western allies. If Hitler could be alive, Westerners would be more dependent on Soviet cooperation to locate him. Others suggest that Stalin genuinely distrusted the evidence. He was paranoid by nature and found it hard to believe that Hitler would have cowardly committed suicide instead of trying to escape. And others still speculate that Stalin knew something the Westerners did not, something that made the possibility of Hitler's survival more plausible than the superficial evidence suggested. What we know for certain is that on the 26th of May, 1945, while the Russians in Berlin were still gathering and analyzing evidence, Stalin, in the Kremlin, told Harry L. Hopkins that he believed Bormann, Goebbels, Hitler, and probably Krebs had escaped and were hidden. This statement is extraordinary. Stalin was receiving reports from his own researchers that supposedly confirmed Hitler's death. Why then would he express doubts to a high-ranking American official? Soviet interrogations of bunker prisoners reveal another disturbing dimension. Interrogators repeatedly accused the prisoners of lying about Hitler's death. They accused Rattenhuber, Hitler's security chief, of preparing his secret escape by submarine to Argentina. Come on, the interrogator once told Rattenhuber after he told the facts for the umpteenth time. Enough of these fairy tales. It was always Spain or Argentina, exactly as Stalin had insisted in May of 1945. Why were the Soviets so convinced that Hitler had escaped when they supposedly possessed evidence to the contrary? This contradiction has never been satisfactorily explained. But let us leave the Soviet perspective momentarily and examine what the Western Allies discovered on their own. Hugh Trevor Roper, the historian sent by British intelligence to investigate what happened in the bunker, published his report confirming that Hitler committed suicide in 1947. The following year, he published his book, The Last Days of Hitler*. The third piece of evidence, according to Professor Richard Evans, was an exhaustive report compiled by the legal authorities of Bavaria in the 50s to issue a death certificate for Hitler. This was necessary to establish a legal basis for the return of some looted works of art that were in his possession. These three pillars, the Trevor Roper report, the testimonies of the bunker survivors, and the Bavarian legal report, constitute the basis of the official version, but each of them presents limitations. The Trevor Roper report relied heavily on testimonies from people who had been loyal to Hitler and who had incentives to provide a particular narrative. The Bavarian legal report was created for a specific administrative purpose, not as an exhaustive criminal investigation. And none of these reports had access to the physical evidence controlled by the Soviets. Eyewitness testimonies, though consistent in their general lines, present discrepancies in the details. Erich Kempka, Hitler's chauffeur, initially stated that Gunscher, who had inspected the body, told him that Hitler had shot himself through the mouth. However, other testimonies placed the shot in the right temple. These inconsistencies could be explained by the chaos of the moment, extreme stress, and the limitations of human memory. Or they could indicate that the witnesses were reciting a story they had not fully witnessed, filling in the gaps with assumptions or instructions received. Testimonies collected by the British Security Service offer a fascinating view of Hitler's final days. They describe how Hitler ordered his staff to prepare for the end. SS bodyguards were destroying their personal documents. One of the doctors received instructions to poison Blondie, Hitler's German Shepherd, and Eva Braun's spaniel. The witnesses described how, on the afternoon of the 29th of April, Hitler went from room to room shaking hands with everyone except his most immediate staff, saying a few words of encouragement and thanks to each one. By the morning of the 30th of April, Russian forces had reached nearby Potsdamer Platz, and the sounds of battle were everywhere. A recorded version suggests that Eva was heard crying, "I would rather die here, I don't want to escape." This last phrase is particularly intriguing. Why would Eva Braun say, "I don't want to escape," if escape was not an option being discussed? The statement implies that an alternative to death existed, an alternative that she rejected, but that was apparently on the table. Was this a spontaneous expression of despair, or does it reveal the existence of an escape plan that Eva chose not to use? The question remains open. Let us advance now to the years following the war, when sightings of Hitler began to multiply all over the world. In the 73 years elapsed since the war, Hitler has been reported living in the foothills of the Andes after escaping by submarine to Argentina, being photographed at 95 years old with a younger Brazilian girlfriend in 1984, and being idolized by staunch Nazis in Colombia in the 50s. Declassified FBI files show that post-war American authorities even took the trouble to investigate some of these rumors. No FBI file records anything close to confirmation of the rumors, but the fact that they were investigated has been interpreted by some conspiracy theorists as proof that they contained truth. One of the most intriguing documents dates from 1955. It is a memorandum from the chief of the CIA base in Maracaibo, Venezuela, who reported that in 1954 a shipping company worker named Philip Citroën told agents that while working for a railroad company in Colombia, he had met someone who insisted on being Adolf Hitler. It was said that this individual, who supposedly bore a striking resemblance to the Nazi leader, lived in Tunja in the Colombian Andes. The city, Citroën assured the CIA, was excessively populated by former German Nazis. According to Citroën, the CIA memorandum from 1955 continued, the Germans in Tunja follow this supposed Adolf Hitler with an idolatry of the Nazi past, addressing him as the Führer and giving him the Nazi salute and the adulation of the stormtroops. The memorandum added that in 1954, Citroën, who was co-owner of a local English-language newspaper in Maracaibo, had also shown the CIA a photo of him sitting next to the Adolf Hitler of Tunja. The three-page document, which appears on the CIA website, highlights a former SS soldier who told spies that he met regularly with Hitler in Colombia. The document suggests that Hitler could have worked as an employee of a shipping company before potentially fleeing to Argentina. On the second page, there is a photograph of the informant, Philip Citroën, with a person he claims is Hitler in the mid-50s. However, the 1955 memorandum also noted the apparent fantasy of Citroën's claims. CIA agents were skeptical, though they clearly considered the report serious enough to document and file it. Was the old man of Tunja really Adolf Hitler, or simply someone who took advantage of the physical resemblance to obtain attention and admiration from nostalgic Nazis? The second explanation seems more probable. But the fact that such communities existed, communities where a supposed Hitler could be openly adored with Nazi salutes, reveals how extensive the network of Nazi sympathizers in South America was. Professor Richard Evans, a Cambridge historian specialized in the Third Reich, has pointed out another motivation behind the persistence of these theories: admiration. He had fooled the Allies so many times before, he must have fooled them again, was the belief, Professor Evans explains. He could not have died, a great character like him, shooting himself in a sordid suicide pact underground. He must have escaped. This observation is psychologically insightful. For Hitler's admirers, the image of the leader pathetically committing suicide in an underground bunker while the enemy approached was unacceptable. It contradicted the narrative of greatness and cunning they had built around his figure. It was much more satisfying to imagine that Hitler had executed one final master deception, outwitting all his enemies and escaping toward a new life. This psychological need for an alternative narrative explains in part why survival theories have persisted for so many decades, despite the lack of conclusive evidence. But not only Hitler's admirers have kept these theories alive, there are also serious researchers who consider that the evidence of Hitler's death is less conclusive than is generally assumed. The CIA investigated reports describing secret compounds, body doubles, and submarines, all unverified but sufficient to drive years of investigations. Intelligence officers tracked leads through Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil, interviewing locals and gathering photographs. Some believe that Hitler escaped not only to South America, but to a secret Nazi base in Antarctica. This idea comes from post-war expeditions, Nazi interest in the continent, and speculative claims about hidden underground facilities. Although it is completely unsupported by credible evidence, the Antarctic theory forms part of the broader imaginary surrounding Nazi survival. But let us return to more solid ground, because there are aspects of the escape routes that are well documented and deserve to be examined in greater detail. The Vatican, the Red Cross, and sympathetic governments were sometimes involuntary participants, providing travel documents or protection that allowed fugitives to escape. Eichmann and Mengele used these routes to settle in Argentina, lending credibility to the theory that Hitler could have done the same. Two primary routes developed independently, but their operators eventually collaborated. The first went from Germany to Spain, then to Argentina. The second led from Germany to Rome, then to Genoa, and finally to South America. The Spanish route was particularly important because of the Franco regime's connections with Nazism. General Elliot, one of the Allied investigators, was cited as opining that Hitler probably fled to Spain, where there were many German refugees who would probably seek to organize Hitler's flight. Elliot also described a possible escape route for Hitler toward Argentina, and opined that the Allies should organize measures to apprehend Hitler, including, if necessary, military operations against Franco's Spain. This last observation is notable. An Allied investigator considered the possibility of Hitler's survival serious enough to suggest military operations against a neutral country to capture him. This was not a marginal conspiracy theory, it was a position held within Allied intelligence circles. During July and August of 1945, reports continued appearing about Hitler being alive. One in July indicated that he had taken a submarine toward Japan or Argentina. Moscow newspapers from the 9th of September carried similar stories. A reporter indicated that the Allies were verifying every report, no matter how fantastic it was. He noted that one story says that Hitler escaped to Japan in a submarine, another that he is in Argentina, a third that he is hiding in Sweden. The latest rumours are that he is on board a yacht in the Elbe River estuary, or living in luxury in a refuge prepared long ago in the Bavarian mountains. This proliferation of contradictory theories could be seen in two ways. On one hand, it suggests confusion and disinformation, with multiple false stories circulating simultaneously. On the other hand, it could indicate that there was some truth behind the smoke, that Hitler had effectively escaped and that the multiple contradictory leads were part of a deliberate effort to confuse pursuers. In March of 1948, newspapers around the world published the account of former German Lieutenant Arthur F. Mackensen, who claimed that on the 5th of May, 1945, during the Soviet bombardment of Berlin, he, Hitler, Eva Braun, and Martin Bormann had escaped from the bunker in tanks. The group supposedly flew from Tempelhof Airport to Tonda, Denmark, where Hitler gave a speech and took a flight with Braun toward the coast. In a May 1948 issue of the Italian magazine Tempo, author Emil Ludwig wrote that a double could have been cremated instead of Hitler, allowing him to flee by submarine to Argentina. Was Mackensen a credible witness or a fabulist seeking attention? His story was never verified, but neither was it definitively refuted. And the mention of a double being cremated in place of Hitler coincides with other theories about the use of substitutes. We know for certain that the Nazi regime employed Hitler doubles. These individuals were selected for their physical resemblance and trained to imitate the dictator's gestures and mannerisms. In the context of an escape plan, using a double to stage a false suicide would have been logical. Historian Gerard Williams, co-author of the book Grey Wolf, has argued that everything was planned to the last detail, including the clothes the doubles would wear. If the Nazis had foreseen the need to provide bodies to confirm Hitler's death, this suggests the escape was planned long before. But here we must stop and consider the quality of the evidence on both sides of the debate. In favor of the official version are the multiple testimonies of bunker survivors, the dental identification of the remains, the Trevor Roper report, and the psychological context of a defeated Hitler who had repeatedly declared his intention to commit suicide rather than surrender. In favor of the survival theory are the inconsistencies in the testimonies, the Soviet refusal to share evidence, Stalin's statements expressing doubts, the submarines that arrive mysteriously in Argentina, the prolonged investigations of the FB1 and the CIA, and the documented existence of escape networks that worked effectively for thousands of other Nazis. The most honest conclusion is that the evidence, although favoring the official version, is not as conclusive as it is generally presented. There is legitimate space for doubt, although that doubt does not equal certainty of survival. What would have happened if Hitler indeed survived and reached Argentina? What would his life in exile have been like? Let us imagine the scenario. A sick old man, probably suffering from Parkinson's or another degenerative disease, arrives at South American shores after an exhausting submarine voyage. He is received by a network of sympathizers who transport him to a remote property in the mountains. There, surrounded by a small circle of devotees, he spends his final years in forced isolation. He is no longer the all-powerful Führer who commanded armies of millions. He is a fugitive, dependent on others for his security and survival. He cannot appear in public. He cannot communicate with the outside world. His great historical project has failed catastrophically. Everything he built lies in ruins. For someone with Hitler's psychology, this fate would have been torture. His extreme narcissism required constant admiration, the feeling of being at the center of historical events. Anonymity and impotence would have been, in a sense, worse than death. Would he have found consolation in his remaining followers? Perhaps. Testimonies about the supposed Hitler of Tunja suggest he was treated with almost religious reverence by local Nazis. A small group of worshippers could provide enough validation to sustain the dictator's wounded ego. But he would have been a pale shadow of what he was. The contrast between commanding the Third Reich and hiding in a South American ranch would have been devastating for anyone, and especially for someone so obsessed with greatness as Hitler. Reports of Hitler sightings in South America during the 50s and 60s describe him as an aged and deteriorated figure, very different from the charismatic leader who had captivated the German masses. If these testimonies reflect a reality, they suggest that exile had destroyed the character even if it had preserved the physical person. And then there is the question of when he would have died. If Hitler survived until the 60s or 70s, he would have reached ages between 75 and 85. His health, already deteriorated in 1945, would probably have worsened progressively. At some point, he would have died in anonymity, and his secret would have been buried with him. Would his protectors have spoken after his death? Apparently not, or at least not in a credible manner. This could be explained by fanatical loyalty, by fear of legal consequences, or simply because the secret had been kept for so long that revealing it no longer made sense. But there is also another possibility. Perhaps Hitler never reached South America. Perhaps the submarines transported other fugitives, not the ultimate leader. Perhaps the sightings were cases of erroneous identification, nostalgic Nazis passing themselves off as their fallen hero, or simply rumors that fed each other. The truth, after 8 decades, may be unrecoverable. Direct witnesses are dead. Documents that could provide definitive evidence may have been destroyed or remain classified in government archives, and the fog of time makes it increasingly difficult to distinguish between historical facts and accumulated legends. What we can state with confidence is that the official history, though probably correct, is not free of reasonable doubt. The circumstances surrounding Hitler's death were extraordinary. A besieged city, an underground bunker, evidence controlled by a hostile power that deliberately sowed confusion, and a rush to close the chapter and move on. In more normal circumstances, with an adequate chain of custody, independent forensic examinations, and testimonies uncontaminated by political pressure, we could be more certain of the conclusions. But those were not the circumstances that existed, and that is why the questions persist. Did Adolf Hitler die on the 30th of April, 1945? Probably. Could he have escaped? Technically, yes, given the resources and networks available. Did he really escape? Evidence does not confirm it, but neither does it absolutely rule it out. And perhaps that uncertainty, that small crack in the building of established history, is what makes this subject continue to fascinate researchers and the general public almost a century later. We have reached the end of this second part of our investigation, but many aspects still remain to be explored. What happened to Martin Bormann, the architect of the escape plans? His fate is another mystery that intertwines with Hitler's. For decades he was sought as one of the most important war criminals still at large. Some claim to have seen him in South America. Others believed he had died during the fall of Berlin. It was not until 1972, when construction workers found human remains near Berlin's Lehrte station, that the mystery seemed to be resolved. DNA analyses performed in 1998 confirmed that the remains were Bormann's. But even this conclusion has been questioned by some. Could the remains have been planted? Could Bormann have sent a double to his death while he escaped? The same questions that surround Hitler apply to his most loyal secretary. And what about Eva Braun? Her fate is even more shrouded in mystery than Hitler's. She was a figure much less known publicly, which would have facilitated her concealment. If she escaped with Hitler, she could have lived for decades more under a false identity, perhaps even outliving her husband. These questions remain open. And as long as they remain open, the story of Hitler's secret plan to survive defeat will continue to be a subject of investigation, speculation, and fascination. If you made it this far, thank you for joining us on this extraordinary journey through the darkest corners of 20th century history. Do not forget to subscribe so as not to miss the continuation of this series. Give it a like if you found this investigation valuable, and leave us in the comments what aspect you would like us to explore more deeply. Do you believe Hitler died in his bunker, as the official version says? Or do you believe there is enough evidence to doubt? Your opinion matters to us. Tell us what you think. Until the next episode, history continues revealing its deepest secrets, and we will continue here to investigate them with you. Let us continue now with the third part of this exhaustive investigation, entering territories that are rarely explored. What really happened in the final days inside the bunker? The walls of that underground refuge witnessed scenes that defy imagination. While Berlin turned into a hell of fire and rubble above their heads, the inhabitants of the Führer bunker lived a surreal existence suspended between denial and despair. Survivor testimonies paint a disturbing picture. Hitler, consumed by Parkinson's and the effects of the medications administered by his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, moved like a shadow of what he had been. His hands trembled uncontrollably. His back had stooped. His voice, which had once hypnotized crowds of hundreds of thousands, had been reduced to a raspy whisper. But even in that deplorable state, Hitler continued to exercise absolute power over those who surrounded him. Generals who commanded non-existent armies continued receiving impossible orders. Officials who knew that all was lost continued feigning optimism before the leader, and an ever-shrinking circle of fanatics remained willing to die for him. Among these last devotees were figures whose stories deserve to be told. Magda Goebbels, wife of the propaganda minister, made a decision that continues to horrify those who study it. Shortly after Hitler's death, she and her husband murdered their 6 children, administering cyanide to them while they slept before committing suicide themselves. In a letter written days before, Magda explained that she could not imagine her children living in a world without National Socialism. What level of fanaticism is required to murder one's own children out of loyalty to an ideology? The question resonates through the decades, a chilling reminder of how far indoctrination can go. But not everyone in the bunker shared this suicidal fanaticism. Some desperately sought ways to escape, to survive the apocalypse that was breaking loose over them. On the night of the 1st of May, hours after Hitler's supposed death, a group of bunker inhabitants attempted a mass breakout. They left in small groups, trying to cross Soviet lines and escape toward the west, where American and British forces offered the prospect of less brutal captivity. Some made it. Others were captured by the Soviets and spent years in prisoner of war camps, and others died in the attempt, shot down by Soviet fire while running through the devastated streets of Berlin. Did Hitler attempt this same flight before them? Was he evacuated while his followers believed he was preparing to die? The possibility persists like a shadow over official history. There is a particularly intriguing testimony that deserves attention. Erich Mansfeld, one of the bunker guards, noted at midnight on the 30th of April 1945 that a bomb crater near the emergency exit had been recently worked into a rectangular shape. He deduced that bodies had been buried there. But when the Soviets arrived days later, they had already been exhumed. The Russians had acted based on previous evidence that Mansfeld had thus confirmed. Who exhumed the bodies? When exactly? And what did they really find? These fundamental questions never received completely satisfactory answers. What we know is that the exhumation was apparently carried out by a special detachment of the Soviet intelligence service, the NKVD. A member of this detachment, Captain Fyodor Pavlovich Vasilki, later told the East Berlin police officer in whose house he was staying how they had secured the bodies of both Hitler and Eva Braun. But the Soviets kept these findings secret for years, and when they finally revealed information, they did so in a partial and contradictory manner. In 1970, by order of Yuri Andropov, then head of the KGB, the remains were exhumed, completely incinerated, and the ashes thrown into a river. The official justification was to prevent the grave from becoming a place of neo-Nazi pilgrimage. But many wondered if the real reason was to destroy evidence that contradicted the official narrative. Why destroy evidence that supposedly confirmed Hitler's death? If the Soviets were sure the remains were genuine, why not keep them as definitive historical proof? The decision to destroy them suggests at the very least that there was something they preferred not to reveal. Let us pass now to examine another fascinating aspect of this story: Nazi technology and its possible role in escape plans. The Third Reich, despite its final collapse, had developed technologies extraordinarily advanced for its era. V-2 rockets, the first operational ballistic missiles in history, Me-262 jet planes, which arrived too late to change the course of the war, but foreshadowed the future of aviation. And Type 21 submarines, which represented a generational leap in submarine warfare. These technologies were not just scientific curiosities, they were strategic resources of enormous value that the victorious powers eagerly disputed. The race to capture German scientists, engineers, and technical documents was almost as intense as the final combats of the war. The American Operation Paperclip, as we mentioned, recruited more than 1,500 German scientists. But this was only the best-known operation. The Soviets carried out similar efforts, transporting thousands of German technicians toward the Soviet Union. The British and French also competed for this intellectual prey. What role did these technologies play in Nazi escape plans? Let us consider the case of the submarines. Type 21 submarines represented a revolutionary advance. They could remain submerged for much longer periods than any previous submarine, thanks to improved battery systems and the Schnorchel, a retractable tube that allowed the use of diesel engines while remaining submerged. Their underwater speed was superior to that of conventional submarines, and their detection systems were harder to deceive. If someone wanted to transport high-value passengers from Europe to South America without being detected, a Type 21 submarine would have been the ideal choice. The U-3523, which was sunk while apparently attempting to escape, was precisely a submarine of this type. Its range would have allowed it to sail non-stop to South America, and although it was sunk before completing its mission, the fact that it was in flight suggests it was part of some evacuation plan. How many other submarines of similar capabilities undertook voyages we never heard of? German naval records from the final days of the war are incomplete. Some submarines simply disappeared without surrendering or being confirmed as sunk. Their fate remains unknown. And beyond the submarines, other technologies existed that could have facilitated escapes. The Luftwaffe maintained long-range planes capable of crossing the Atlantic. Some modified versions of the Junkers Ju-290 bomber had enough range to fly from Europe to Argentina, with refueling stops in Allied territories like the Canary Islands or the Azores. Were these planes used to evacuate high-ranking individuals? Records are fragmentary, but testimonies exist suggesting that clandestine flights continued even after the official surrender. But perhaps the most mysterious technological aspect of Nazi survival plans has to do with finances. The Nazi regime had accumulated enormous wealth through the systematic looting of occupied territories. Gold from the central banks of conquered countries, works of art stolen from public and private collections, property confiscated from murdered Jews, jewelry torn from corpses in the extermination camps. What happened to all this? Part was recovered by the Allies, part was returned to its original owners or their heirs, but a significant portion simply disappeared. Treasure hunters have sought the legendary Nazi gold for decades. They have explored alpine lakes where boxes of ingots were supposedly thrown. They have investigated caves and mines where works of art could have been hidden. They have tracked bank accounts in Switzerland and other financial havens. Some spectacular findings have occurred. In 2012, an apartment in Munich revealed a collection of more than 1,400 works of art, many of them stolen by the Nazis, which had remained hidden for 70 years. In 2015, the Swiss Bergier Commission published a report detailing how the country's banks had handled Nazi assets during and after the war. But these recoveries represent probably only a fraction of the total. Most of the Nazi treasure remains missing. And the question persists, where is it and who controls it? If Martin Bormann effectively organized the systematic transfer of assets out of Germany, as multiple sources suggest, these funds would have provided the necessary resources to sustain a network of fugitives for decades. Remote properties, high-quality false documents, bribes to local officials, security personnel, medical care. All this costs money, and apparently there was money in abundance. The connection between Nazi funds and the German community in Argentina is well documented. Many of the Nazis who escaped to that country did not arrive as destitute refugees, but as individuals with significant resources. They were able to buy properties, establish businesses, and live comfortably for decades. How did they obtain these resources? The most logical explanation is that they had access to the funds transferred by Bormann and others before the collapse of the Reich. And if these funds were available for mid-level criminals, they would certainly have been available for Hitler himself if he effectively escaped. Let us reflect now on the broader implications of everything we have examined. Hitler's secret plan to survive defeat was not simply a desperate attempt by an individual to save his life. It was the final expression of a mentality that characterized the entire Nazi regime, the inability to accept reality when it contradicted its desires. For 12 years, Nazism had operated on the basis that will could triumph over facts. Hitler genuinely believed that his personal determination could overcome any material obstacle. When German armies were outnumbered, he ordered impossible counteroffensives, convinced that spirit would triumph over numbers. When the German economy faltered, he demanded more production without providing the necessary resources. And when defeat became inevitable, he sought a magical way out that would allow him to evade the consequences. This mentality did not die with the Third Reich. It continues to manifest itself in different forms until the present. Leaders who reject scientific evidence because it contradicts their political preferences. Movements that create alternative realities where their failures are always the fault of others. Conspiracy theories that offer comfortable explanations for uncomfortable phenomena. The study of Nazism, including its pathetic final days, is valuable precisely because it shows us where this denial of reality can lead. Hitler ended up in an underground bunker, surrounded by fanatics, giving orders to armies that no longer existed. That was the logical fate of someone who had spent his entire career substituting will for analysis and desire for fact. Whether he physically escaped from that bunker or not is, in a sense, less important than the fact that he never psychologically escaped from the trap he himself had built. His final act, whether suicide or flight, was simply another manifestation of the same inability to honestly confront his situation. And this is perhaps the most important lesson we can extract from all this investigation. It is not so much whether Hitler lived or died in April of 1945. It is what type of thinking led him to that point and how that thinking continues to manifest itself in our own time. We have come a long way in this investigation. We have examined declassified documents, witness testimonies, disputed forensic evidence, mysterious submarines, documented escape routes, and theories that have persisted for almost a century.